Okay, welcome back. In this final and last project scene from this Introduction to Render Tree tutorial for Softimage XSI, we're going to do something pretty interesting. We're going to be working with the Mental Ray Fast Skin Shader. Okay, so we're going to spend quite a while going over the Skin Shader, plugging in different maps that control different things to achieve an effect. So, enough with the chit chat, let's get down to business. Let's go ahead and open up the start scene, which is going to be called JellyFish_start. Jellyfish. Interesting. What does i3D Jack have awaiting for us? There's a big old jellyfish should pop up on your screen like this one. If you want to go ahead and spin around this, this is a high-res jellyfish that I created using ZBrush 3 to be exact. And this jellyfish right now only has if we open up the material manager using Control 7 to do that, of course, all we have is a scene material default font as usual. Boring, very boring. And if we do some render previews of this, what we have is a pretty interesting scene, kind of this underwater scene with a volumic light being projected against this jellyfish. But of course the material the jellyfish has now is not interesting at all. So let's click on this orange button here, which is a memo cam that I saved for you from this angle here, which I think is the most interesting angle of this scene. You can change the angle if you want, but I'm going to stick with this angle right here, which looks great. So what does this scene comprise of? Well, it's a dark scene deep in the abyss of the ocean. And there's this kind of light coming from the background. Is it from the sun? Is it from a deep sea dive? Well, actually a diver at this depth would probably die. So maybe it's light coming from one of those deep sea explorer subs. I don't know, who knows? Use your imagination. Okay, and then we have this jellyfish. Now inside the jellyfish we have an actual light. When I was doing research and looking for photographs of jellyfish, when I was going to go ahead and model this in ZBrush, I found that there's a lot of deep sea jellyfish that actually and interestingly have their own light sources. Inside of them they have the ability to create these lights, and it just looks amazing. Just go on Google and do an image search for jellyfish and you'll see what I mean. So I decided to do kind of this jellyfish, kind of a hybrid out of my imagination and also from my reference that I was able to collect. And I placed a light inside, which would make it look more interesting. It would also help to make the subsurface scattering effect look more interesting itself, which is why I also chose to do that. So it's a pretty simple scene. And jellyfish right now has a lot of detail and whatnot. It is going to affect rendering time a little bit, so be aware of that. What I'm going to be doing is pausing the video between renders. So when we do test renders, they are going to take about a minute to do, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're doing constant test renders, it does get pretty annoying. So you'll see what I mean in a moment. Edit that out of the video. Okay, so let's get started. So you saw what our test render looks like. We have a long way to go to make this look like a nice jellyfish. Okay, so what we need to do is open up the material manager here like usual. Let's go to materials and create a brand new material. Let's open up its PPG and change its name to jellyfish matte or material. Okay, this Fong node, we're not going to delete anything, we're just going to leave it alone. What we're going to do is go to nodes, illumination, and we have two subsurface scattering shaders. We have the fast skin shader and we have the fast subsurface scattering shader, which is just the simple subsurface scattering shader. Now if we pull up the simple subsurface scattering shader, we don't have a lot of options. I mean, we have plenty if you compare it to like a Fong shader, but as a subsurface scattering shader, we just have enough options to make the subsurface scattering effect work and not much past that, which is not a bad thing. You can use this shader for different things, like I said earlier, for candlesticks or anything like that. What we're interested in is the fast skin shader, because if we open up the fast skin shader's PPG, we'll notice we have a ton of options. Okay, so it's going to take a while for us to set this up. Obviously, we have so many options. So how do we get this fast skin shader to work? Well, in XSI, it's actually very easy. Take this little purple port icon and plug it into the material port, and it's the only one you can plug it into, or you're allowed to plug it into the material node here. You notice the little shader ball preview changed to show you that. So now this is the fast skin shader. Let's go ahead and let's apply the fast skin shader to our jellyfish. Okay, let's open up the attributes here, or the property page for it. I'm going to do a quick preview render here, and by default this is what we get. Now this is pretty interesting because you can see what's happening here. We have some light transmitting from the light that's behind the jellyfish over there, coming from the volumic light. And we also have light that's being emitted from inside the jellyfish, like those jellyfish that I was talking to you about earlier when I was doing my research on jellyfish. Some jellyfish actually project their own light, and they'll have light inside of them, and it'll look something like this. So that looks pretty interesting. Kind of looks like jello in a way, and that's the beauty of the fast skin shader, or subsurface scattering in general. It allows you to achieve that kind of an effect. And you can see here the tentacles down toward the bottom are looking very interesting. Look kind of like this gummy bear type material. If you've ever eaten gummy bears, if you haven't, go out and get some. And this looks very interesting. Obviously much more interesting than using a simple, Phong shader with just gray. So this already looks more interesting and much better. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to hit this little lock button here. That's going to lock down the render preview window. That way, whenever I make a change to the shader, it doesn't update automatically, because that could seriously slow me down. So I want to make sure that that lock is engaged. That way, when I make changes, it doesn't update. I'll have to manually update by hitting this refresh button up here. Okay? Alright, so here's the fast skin shader's main attributes, or main properties here in the diffuse tab of its property page. We have a ton of different attributes and things to control. Now, first things first, if you want to reduce the rendering speed, you have to reduce the quality of the light map of this fast skin shader. So how do we do that? Well, the fast skin shader, one of the things that makes it work is the light map. And the light map is, well, the light map is going to determine how good the shader is going to look overall. That's basically, in the end result, that's what you get. Here you have light map samples. Now it's set by default to 300, which is very high. Okay, we can set it to higher than that as well. We can go as far as 1,000 or even more if you wanted to. There's really no point to doing that. What we're going to do is we're going to set it down to something pretty low, something like 32, which is very low. And if we refresh this and render again, now you notice that when it finishes rendering, it's going to look pretty bad. Now we have a lot of artifacting, a lot of grain, a lot of bad things are going on here. And that's because we set the light samples down to 32. But the good thing about that, it helps to render a little bit faster. So while we're in the previewing stage, we're going to keep that down to about 32 samples, just so that it renders faster. So we get results quicker, and we're not sitting here forever waiting for preview renders, which can, if you're impatient, can drive you nuts. So next thing, let's look at these diffuse parameters and things here. We have an ambient color. Now the ambient color I'm not going to play around with because we don't want to add any type of fake ambience to this. It works similar to the way that ambience works with a Phong shader or a blend, which makes things look very unrealistic and not very good at all. So we're going to stay away from that parameter. Then we have an overall color multiplier. The way that this shader works is basically all these different layers like epidermal scatter, subdermal scatter, backscatter, and diffuse, they all work like layers being composited on top of each other, similar to the way that you work with layers in something like Photoshop. And what happens is this overall color multiplier will be overlaid or composited on top of everything else. So it works to influence the final result. Now by default it's set to white, which is not going to influence the final result too much. So How do we influence the final result better? Well, we'll skip that parameter for now and we'll work on these other parameters, and then at the end I'll show you how that one comes into play and kind of adds the icing on the cake. Okay, so here we have the diffuse set of parameters, and we have two parameters. We have a weight value and we also have a color value. Now the color value is where you want to plug in texture. Say if you have a monster or a human character, or in this case a big old jellyfish, if you did texture it, which in this case I did, there is a texture for this jellyfish, a color map, a color texture, you would plug that texture into this diffuse color. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to plug in a color into the diffuse texture, but let's hold off on that for the moment. The weight. The weight value is going to determine the influence of that color here. In this case, if we plugged in a texture, the weight's going to determine how much of an influence that texture has on the overall look of the object. In this case, 0.3 for the weight is pretty low. I usually won't use something that low because then it'll be very difficult to even see the texture, if you can even see it at all. So it'll be like if you didn't even have a texture plugged into the fast skin shader. And then down here we have an epidermal scatter layer. This is similar to how human skin is. Human skin is composed of different layers: the epidermis, the subdermal layer, and then of course there's a backscatter layer. This is a jellyfish, not a human being, but we can still use the shader effectively to create a very interesting looking jellyfish. So the epidermal scatter layer is a top layer that goes on top of the subdermal, and that goes on top of the backscatter. The backscatter is kind of like the back layer that light gets through. Okay, now each one of these layers has different attributes like the color, weight, and a radius. Alright, except for the backscatter, which has a depth layer, and that determines how far light can go in through the material. So let's start up here with epidermal, or better yet, let's start with the bottom, with the last layer here, with the backscatter, so you can see what in the world is going on here. Okay, so backscatter. Here we have a color, we have a weight, radius, and depth. In order to be able to see the effect of the backscatter better, I'm going to turn the weight of the epidermal scatter down to 0, so that turns it off. I'm going to take the weight of the diffuse down to 0, turning that off, and I'm going to turn off the subdermal scatter by putting its, no, not the radius, the weight, down to 0. So now the backscatter has is the main one that's going to be influencing this, with a weight of 0.5 or 50%, I should say. So at these default settings, let's see what happens. And the next thing I want to do also, so we can see this better, I'm going to go to specular. I'm going to take the weight of this down to 0. That way it turns off all the specular and reflection parameters. And in advanced settings, I really don't have anything to change there. That's perfectly fine how it is. So right now we turned everything off: reflection, specular, subdermal, epidermal, and diffuse. The only thing that's really influencing this mainly is the backscatter layer. So let's go ahead and refresh this this preview window and see what we get. Okay, so this is what we've got. With everything turned off and only using the backscatter layer, this is what we have. So the backscatter is what's influencing heavily this kind of purplish pink color. The light is going right through it. It's very translucent, almost like jello. Very similar to what a jellyfish is like. And that's probably where jello got its name from. I really don't know if that's the case, but I would imagine that that could be a reason why jello and jellyfish share a very similar name. Of course, that's very way off topic. But we can Google that later on our free time if we'd like to find out the history of jello. Okay, so back here in the backscatter, I don't like that color for the backscatter, so I'm going to change the color to something else. For the red, I'm going to put that to 1. For the green, I'm going to put that to 0.6, and for the blue, I'm going to put that to about 0.32. And that's going to give me this kind of peach type color. Now, if we do a refresh here, we can now see that it totally changed completely. It went from purple to this kind of a very pale blue grayish color, which doesn't look too bad. Now, next thing I want to do is control the radius and the depth. Now the radius is going to control how far out this backscatter effect goes. The smaller the radius, the smaller the effect is going to be. The area where the light's going to spread out along the surface of this jellyfish. So I want the radius to be pretty high. So I'm going to increase the radius to 50, and I'm going to take the depth and increase it to 50 as well, because my research shows that jellyfish are very, very translucent creatures. So let's go ahead and do a render region of that. Okay, finished rendering. This is what we have. It looks very similar to before, only the subsurface scattering effect is more pronounced. It's stronger. Light is able to transmit through the material of the jellyfish a lot easier. So there's more translucency in this jellyfish's backscatter layer, which is exactly what I wanted. But now what I'm going to do is increase the weight to a full 100%. Let's see what we get now. Okay, now we can see that the light is transmitting through it very easily, and it's transmitting a lot. There's a lot of light coming out of this thing because it's so translucent. I mean, it's a jellyfish. So I like those settings, and I'm going to keep it at that. Now this looks a little bit blown out and bright here, but that's going to be fixed once the other layers are activated and they start to take effect. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and activate the subdermal scatter layer. Alright, so let's take the weight of the backscatter down to 0 to turn it off, and let's activate the subdermal scatter. I'm going to put it all the way to a full setting of 1. I'm going to max out the radius to 50, and now we're going to see what the subdermal scatter layer looks like by itself. So this is what the subdermal scatter layer is controlling in terms of its job and its place in the fast skin shader. As you can see, it doesn't have a whole lot of influence, but it does have some influence and does add to the total overall effect of subsurface scattering. Now let's turn the weight of that off, and let's turn on the weight of the epidermal layer on completely, 1 to 1, and max the radius out to 50. And let's do refresh of that. Okay, so this is what the epidermal scatter layer looks like, the topmost layer, by itself at full influence. Now right now all these layers don't look like much by themselves, but in the end, when they're all composited together, it's going to look like the way it's supposed to look like. And the other thing we have to also take note of is that we have to apply our texture maps to this jellyfish in order to make it look right. So now that you saw a sort of a technical breakdown of this shader, what these different parameters do and how they affect the overall look by themselves, it's time to put it to practice and start to plug in texture maps and show you how to do that to get something that looks like a jellyfish as opposed to this strange thing. But I'll end this video here, and in the next video we're going to go ahead and get that done.